The crack of leather against flesh split the quiet frontier air, sharp as a gunshot though no bullet flew. Dust hung in the sunlit yard like smoke, drifting slow, as if even the earth recoiled from the sound. A young woman, no more than 22, staggered backward, her arms clutched tight around the swell of her belly. She whispered to the life inside her, lips trembling, "Hold on, child, just hold on." Her mother-in-law stood before the cabin door, whip dangling from her hand, the rawhide tip still quivering like a serpent's tongue. Weathered cheeks hollowed by years of bitterness gave her the look of stone more than flesh. Her eyes carried neither pity nor patience. Around the yard, neighbors shifted uneasily, drawn by the commotion yet rooted in silence, as though the scene chained them where they stood. The cabin itself leaned weary against the prairie sky, wood bleached gray, shutters rattling in the faint breeze. Chickens scratched nervously at the dirt, unsettled by the violence that stirred the air. From beyond the rail fence, a boy no older than 10 whispered to his sister, "Ma said she's near to birthing." The girl pressed her finger to her lips, eyes wide, but neither turned away. Children learn the truth of cruelty quicker than they ought. The whip rose again. The young woman flinched, stumbling against the step, one hand splayed to shield her belly. The mother-in-law's voice cut sharp, "You'll learn respect, girl, even if your child's first cry is drowned in your own." Then another voice, quieter, but steady enough to still the gathering. A man stepped forward from the fringe of the yard. He was 26, lean as a fence post, with eyes carved deep by work and worry. His boots were worn, his shirt patched, yet there was a dignity to the way he carried himself, as if decency was the one possession life had not stripped away. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but carrying, "enough. There's a baby comin'. Don't let the Lord find your hand bloody when it takes its first breath." The crowd stirred, shame rippling through them like a sudden wind. A preacher, gray-bearded and stooped, cleared his throat. His voice trembled as he called out, half prayer, half warning, "Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, lest they be discouraged." The verse lingered in the air, settling heavy on the conscience of all who heard. The mother-in-law's eyes burned, but for the first time her hand faltered. The whip drooped, its threat slackening. Silence spread wide and deep, broken only by the uneasy shuffle of hooves from a tethered mule, and the faint cry of an infant from some cabin down the road. The rancher moved closer, not with swagger but with care, like one stepping near a spooked horse. He bent, offering his hand to the woman still crouched at the steps. Her lip bled, her hair stuck damp to her temple, but her eyes, dark, searching, caught his. For a breath she seemed torn between shame and the need for help. Finally, trembling, she placed her palm in his. He lifted her gently. She leaned into him, her belly heavy against his side, as though she bore not only a child but the weight of judgment itself. He guided her toward the cabin door, each step deliberate, his silence stronger than any sermon. The neighbors watched, some with guilt, others with quiet relief that someone else had broken the spell. Yet not one offered to help, not one raised voice in her defense. Their silence hung like a second lash, invisible but stinging all the same. Inside the doorway, the air shifted cooler, smelling faintly of wood smoke and stale bread. The rancher paused, one hand steady at her elbow. Behind them, the mother-in-law stood rigid, whip dangling at her side, her knuckles white. For the first time, a flicker of doubt shadowed her stern face, as though the world she ruled by fear might be slipping beyond her grasp. The woman's breath came ragged. She clutched her belly and whispered, so softly the words were almost a prayer, "Please, don't let her near the child." The rancher met her eyes, and though he spoke no vow, something in his steady gaze was answer enough. He guided her further inside, away from the sunlight, away from the eyes of the town, into a darkness that promised shelter if not yet peace. The whip slipped from the older woman's fingers, striking the dirt with a dull thud. The neighbors, still hushed, shifted as though waking from a trance. A storm had passed, but the air was charged, as if thunder yet waited beyond the horizon. The young woman leaned against the wall, tears glistening though she tried to hide them. The rancher turned toward the door, back straight, eyes fixed on the figure still standing outside. And in that moment, though no word passed between them, it was clear to all who saw that the fight was not finished, only paused. The whip had fallen, but the battle for mercy had only just begun. The cabin's dim light held a quiet hum of tension, walls steeped in old smoke and years of toil. The young woman lowered herself onto a rough-hewn chair, her breath uneven, one hand pressed firm to her belly as if shielding the child within from the memory of leather's sting. The rancher busied himself with small motions, the kind that asked no permission. He set a loaf of bread on the table, fetched a chipped tin cup of water, and laid them before her without ceremony. His movements were awkward, not from reluctance but from unfamiliarity. Kindness had not often been his work, yet he bore it like a duty. Her eyes followed his hands, wide with suspicion, as though each gesture might conceal some hidden debt. She hesitated before reaching for the bread, fingers trembling more from shame than hunger. The crust crackled under her grip, and she tore off a piece, chewing slowly, as though every bite might be weighed by the eyes that judged her. He leaned against the doorframe, hat in hand, his face shadowed by the fading afternoon light. "Eat," he said quietly, no command in it, only suggestion. "Work's heavy enough out here without carrying it on an empty stomach." She lowered her gaze, cheeks flushed. Kindness costs dear in these parts. Folks don't offer it unless they're wanting something back. His jaw tightened, but not in anger. He studied the wood grain of the table, as though the truth lived there. "Some costs are worth the payin'," he murmured. Silence stretched between them, heavy yet not suffocating. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass, a sound like distant waves on a forgotten shore. The mother-in-law's shadow passed briefly against the window, her figure stiff, arms folded. Watching. Waiting. Control was not so easily relinquished. The woman shifted uneasily, catching the glance. She swallowed hard and whispered, almost to herself, "When my husband died, she said I stayed only by her mercy. Said I owed her hands, back and womb. Said a roof was payment enough." The rancher lifted his eyes to her, expression unreadable. He saw the frayed hem of her dress, shoes worn near to nothing, calluses etched deep into her palms, signs not of grace received but of labor extracted. He did not press her with questions. The marks on her spoke plainly enough. From outside came the sudden chatter of children. Two barefoot boys peered through the window, their laughter quick to hush when they saw her inside. One called, uncertain, "Mister, is she gonna be okay?" The rancher straightened, moving toward the door. He rested a hand against the frame and answered with a steadiness that belied the storm inside him. "The Lord keeps watch over mothers and children. She'll be okay." The boys nodded solemnly, as though scripture had been spoken. Their innocence lingered like a bomb even after their shadows darted away. The woman's eyes filled, though no tear spilled. She breathed, softer now. "Innocence, it don't last long out here. The land takes it. Hunger takes it. Cruel tongues take it faster still." He stepped back toward the table, his boots whispering against the rough boards. He poured another cup of water, setting it within her reach though she had not asked. "Not always," he said. "Sometimes it lingers. If folk guard it." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she said nothing. The bread in her hand grew small. She ate the last piece slowly, each chew steadying her like a prayer. Evening fell, light dimming through the shutter cracks, painting the room in long stripes of gold and shadow. The rancher struck a match and lit the lamp, its glow softening the harsh lines of her face. For a fleeting moment, she looked less like a woman beaten down and more like a mother on the verge of promise. She shifted in her chair, speaking low. "If she finds me resting, she'll lash me again. Said there's work that don't wait for bellies or babies." He met her eyes then, and the air between them thickened. "She won't raise her hand tonight. Not while I'm here." Her breath caught between disbelief and a fragile hope. "And tomorrow?" The lamp flame trembled in a draught, casting their shadows tall against the wall. He did not answer at once. His silence was deliberate, as though shaping the weight of truth. Finally, he said, "Tomorrow ain't here yet. Tonight's enough to hold." Outside, the prairie wind carried the faint smell of rain, though the sky was clear. The mother-in-law's footsteps creaked across the porch, pausing near the door. Her presence pressed heavy, a warning that mercy was a fleeting guest in this house. The woman's hand curled protectively over her belly. she whispered to the unborn child, words meant not to be heard but carried, maybe the world won't hate us after all. The rancher turned his gaze to the door, jaw set, eyes steady. He knew the shadow waiting beyond it, knew the fight was not with weather or land but with cruelty rooted in human hearts. And in the stillness that followed, it was clear that though the whip had been laid down, its echo had only begun to stir. Morning light spilled across the prairie like a slow-rolling tide, brushing the cabin walls with pale gold. But where the sun reached gently, the weight of judgment pressed harder. By the well in town, voices rose in clusters, sharpened with gossip. Women drew buckets while their tongues drew blood. "She's no widow worth pity," one whispered, hands on her hips. "A burden is what she is. That rancher's a fool to keep her under his roof, fool enough to tether himself to her shame." The others nodded, their silence not agreement but complicity. Words left unchallenged often cut deeper than the ones spoken. At the saloon, men leaned heavy on counters, mugs clutched like shields. "Ain't right," one drawled, spit hitting the sawdust floor. "That boy can barely scrape a livin' off his land. Now he's feedin' another man's woman." Laughter barked, though none of it rang true. Even mockery trembled when guilt brushed its edges. The preacher heard these mutterings, every word heavy as stone. He walked the narrow streets with Bible under arm, shoulders bent not from age but from the burden of knowing his congregation wanted judgment more than mercy. At night he prayed, though his voice shook, "Lord, soften their hearts, lest we stand condemned by the hardness of our own." Yet even he hesitated when their eyes demanded silence. The young rancher bore it quieter still. He rose before dawn, working the land until his shirt clung with sweat, his hands raw, his back bent. In town, he felt the stares pressing on him as surely as the sun on his neck. Some greeted him, others looked away, but all weighed him as though his worth was measured not by his toil but by the woman who now leaned on his presence. He kept his head low, his words few, but in his silence there lived a resolve. Decency unspoken was still decency kept. The woman, too, felt the lash of unseen whips. When she walked to the market, she pulled her shawl close, though the air was warm, as though fabric could shield her from the sting of eyes. Children stared until their mothers pulled them away. She carried bread back to the cabin, but every step echoed with whispers, shame, burden, cursed. She told herself she could bear their cruelty, but at night, with her belly shifting beneath her hands, she wondered what world awaited the child. Would its first cradle be scorn? One evening, as lanterns flickered in the gathering dusk, the townsfolk held a meeting outside the church. The benches creaked beneath the weight of men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes keen with judgment disguised as concern. The mother-in-law stood at the center, her face pinched with righteousness, whip coiled at her side like a relic of authority. "It ain't decent," she declared, her voice sharp as frost. "The girl brings ruin. And that boy," she jerked her chin toward the rancher, "he keeps her when she ought to be sent away. God does not bless houses built on sin." The preacher shifted uneasily, glancing down at his worn Bible. But before he could speak, the rancher rose, his tall frame outlined against the dimming sky. He took no pulpit, spoke no grand sermon, but his voice carried with the steadiness of a man who had lived hard truths. "I seen men shoot each other quicker'n spit," he said, "and still they didn't bear the weight you're layin' on her. She ain't sinned by carryin' life. If you call her shame, then you call that child shame too. And I won't stand for it." The crowd stirred, whispers rising, faces shifting between agreement and disapproval. Some looked to the preacher, but he remained silent, torn between courage and the fear of losing his flock. The woman, standing at the edge of the gathering, felt tears sting her eyes, not of weakness, but of longing. To be spoken for, even quietly, even against a tide, was a mercy she had thought long gone. She wrapped her arms around her belly, whispering to the child, "Hear him. Someone speaks for us still." The days that followed carried more whispers, but also something new, doubt. Where cruelty had walked unchallenged, now uncertainty shadowed its steps. Children, curious and unburdened by gossip, crept near the cabin. One morning a girl left a scrap of cloth on the porch, soft and clean, folded with care. No note, only the simple gift of innocence. Inside the cabin, The woman found another gift, one carved by hands calloused from labor. A small wooden cradle rested near her bed, plain but sturdy, its edges smoothed with patience. She touched the wood, her fingers tracing the marks of effort. No words had announced it, no pride had claimed it, yet the cradle spoke louder than any sermon. A place had been made for her child. She sank to her knees beside it, one hand pressed to her belly, and whispered through tears, "Maybe the world won't hate us after all." But even as the cradle steadied her heart, shadows lengthened. On the horizon, storm clouds gathered, heavy with promise. And in the hush of the coming night, she felt it deep within her bones. Peace was never safe for long on this land. Thunder rumbled low across the prairie, the kind that rolled slow but promised more than it gave. The sky had gone heavy and gray, a lid pressed over the land. Inside the cabin, the air thickened with another storm, one not carried by clouds but by blood and fear. The young woman clutched her belly, her breath sharp, sweat dampening her brow. The time had come too soon. Her body bent with pain, a rhythm deeper than reason, pulling her toward birth like the tide drags the sea. The mother-in-law sat rigid by the hearth, arms crossed, lips tight with disdain. "Too early," she muttered, as if accusation could halt the child's coming. "Fool girl don't know how to keep even this right." She would not fetch a midwife, would not move to comfort. Cruelty had rooted so deep in her that even life's most sacred moment became another weapon. The rancher, who had returned from tending his cattle at dusk, stood frozen at the threshold, his hat dripping from the rain that had begun to fall. He saw the woman bent double, her face pale as paper, her hands clutching the table's edge. Fear gripped him, not of work or hardship, he knew those well, but of failing when it mattered most. He swallowed hard and set the hat aside, voice steadier than his heart. "I'll stay. I'll help." The older woman scoffed. "What do you know of birth? Best leave her to her fate." He ignored her. Kneeling beside the young woman, he whispered, "You're not alone. I'll fetch water. I'll see this through with you." She met his eyes, and in them he saw both terror and trust. That trust struck him harder than any storm. The night deepened. Rain hammered the roof, wind rattled the shutters. Lightning lit the room in jagged flashes, each one carving shadows sharp across their faces. Between the peals of thunder came her cries, raw and unhidden, the sound of life demanding its place. The rancher brought clean cloth, boiling water, anything his rough hands could manage. He wiped her brow, murmured words clumsy but true. "You're stronger than the pain. The Lord walks with you through this valley." Once, as her body seized with another contraction, a knock startled the door. Two children stood outside, soaked to the bone, clutching bundles. The oldest, a girl of 7, lifted a blanket, her small arms trembling under its weight. "Mama says every baby deserves something soft," she said, voice thin but sure. "So she don't come cold into the world." The rancher's throat tightened. He took the blanket as though it were scripture itself. "That's the truest gospel I've heard all year," he said. The children fled back into the storm, leaving behind their innocence like a lamp in the dark. The woman wept when he laid the blanket near the cradle. Not for pain this time, but for the kindness she had thought forever denied. Through clenched teeth she whispered, "Don't let them take my child. Promise me." He grasped her hand, calloused fingers closing over hers. "I promise. No one takes what God has given." His words were plain, but the weight in them was iron. Hours passed, marked not by clocks but by the rise and fall of her cries, the rhythm of her body laboring against the storm. At one point she slumped back, eyes glazed, whispering, "I can't." The rancher bent close, speaking as though to anchor her soul. "Yes, you can. You've carried this far. Every breath brings you closer. Yeah, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil, for he is with you." His voice shook, but the verse steadied him, steadying her in turn. The mother-in-law lingered near, her face twisted with something unspoken. Fear, perhaps, or fury that the girl found strength without her. But she did nothing. Her power slipped each time the rancher placed another cloth, whispered another word, stood as witness against her cruelty. Near dawn, the storm outside began to ease, the thunder rolling farther off, the rain softening to a steady patter. But inside the cabin, the storm reached its height. The woman cried out one final time, body convulsing, the air thick with the raw scent of birth. Then, a silence sharp as a knife, broken only by the faint, unsteady cry of a newborn. The rancher froze, heart pounding. The woman gasped, tears streaming, her eyes wild with disbelief. The child's cry grew louder, fragile but fierce, echoing like the promise of tomorrow. He wrapped the babe in the blanket the children had brought, laying it gently in her arms. For the first time in years, the young woman smiled, weary but radiant, her lips brushing her child's damp hair. She whispered, "You're born into mercy." But as the first light of morning crept through the shutters, the mother-in-law stepped closer, her shadow long across the floor. Her hand hovered near the cradle, fingers curled as if ready to strike. The rancher rose slowly, eyes locking with hers, voice low but unyielding. "If you raise that hand again, you raise it against both of us." The room held its breath. The child whimpered, thunder rumbled faint in the distance, and the storm was not yet gone. The child's cry rose thin at first, then stronger, filling the cabin with a sound both fragile and defiant. Dawn seeped through the cracks of the shutters, laying pale ribbons of light across the floorboards. The young woman lay propped against a pillow, her face pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion yet shining with a reverence too deep for words. She clutched her baby close, whispering into the downy hair, "You were born into mercy." The rancher stood at her side, shoulders bowed from a night spent bearing more than he knew he could carry. His hands, still damp with the labor's work, trembled faintly as he reached for the wooden cradle he had shaped in silence days before. He placed it near the bed with care, every scrape in its grain a testimony to quiet resolve. The mother-in-law lingered nearby, her shadow stretching long, her eyes narrowing at the child as if its breath stole power from her lungs. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air raw and sweet, the prairie washed clean. Neighbors, drawn by the cries that had pierced the night, gathered in the yard. Their faces hovered between curiosity and judgment, waiting for proof of either tragedy or redemption. Their silence pressed against the walls until it seeped inside, thickening the air with expectation. The rancher lifted the infant, swaddled in the blanket the children had brought, and for a moment he held the child as if the whole of creation rested in his arms. The room hushed, even the mother-in-law pausing, startled by the reverence in his gaze. He lowered the baby into the cradle, hands lingering on the rim as though reluctant to let go. The preacher, who had come with the crowd, stepped forward, voice low but steady. "The Lord setteth the solitary in families," he said, quoting from the Psalms. His words fell like a benediction, soft but unshakable. The young woman's lips trembled. She looked at the rancher, her voice breaking with disbelief. "Why would you stand for us? Why risk the scorn they heap on your name?" He met her eyes, his voice quiet, stripped of pride. "Because mercy's worth more than silence. And some things God puts in a man's path, he don't step aside from." Her tears came then, not of weakness but release, spilling down her cheeks as her baby's small fist grasped her finger. The neighbors shifted, some lowering their eyes, shame flickering across their faces as they witnessed what cruelty had nearly stolen. The murmur of judgment softened into uneasy quiet, the storm outside replaced by one within their own hearts. But the mother-in-law would not yield so easily. She stepped forward, whip coiled in her hand, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You'll ruin him same as you ruined my son. You and that child are curses, not blessings." She raised her hand, whip poised, the old hunger for power returning. The rancher moved before thought, placing himself between her and the cradle. His body stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady. "No more," he said, his tone quiet but carrying weight that no storm could shake. "If you raise that hand, you raise it against both of us. And I won't let you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The whip trembled in her grip, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. Then, slowly, the strength drained from her arm. The coil slipped from her fingers, falling useless to the floor. She stumbled back, her power broken, her authority unraveled before the witness of dawn. The preacher stepped closer, his voice rising just enough for those outside to hear. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The words echoed through the cabin, carried on the morning light. The baby whimpered, and the young woman bent over the cradle, smoothing the blanket, her touch tender as a prayer. She whispered to her child, "You were born into mercy, and mercy will guard you." The neighbors began to drift away, their judgment shaken, their silence carrying the weight of all they had seen. Some left humbled, others resentful, but none untouched. The prairie stretched endless around them, yet something had shifted, a seed planted in soil long hardened by cruelty. The rancher bent to gather the whip from the floor. He carried it outside and laid it on the dirt, leaving it there like a snake stripped of venom. When he returned, his eyes fell on the cradle, the child within, and the woman who, though weary, glowed with the strength of one who had endured. The morning sun broke fully then, spilling across the room, gilding the rough boards, the cradle, the faces within. It was no mansion, no triumph shouted loud, but it was something deeper. A claim staked in mercy, a stand made not with weapons but with steadfastness. The woman met the rancher's gaze, gratitude heavy in her eyes. No vows were spoken, no promises sealed, yet the air between them carried the weight of something binding. In the hush that followed, as the prairie breathed under a sky scrubbed clean, it was plain to see. The storm had broken, but what it left was not ruin. It was a beginning. And though the child's cry still echoed in the small cabin, so too did the dawn, whispering of a home built not by power, but by the smallest mercies carried through the night. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.